So a couple of thoughts. One, I know this is really boring and no one wants to hear this, although it's talked about a lot. Like, understand the billing model of the services you're consuming. I saw so many people blow so much money early on with Lambda because they just didn't understand how they were being billed by it. And I even helped out on a training course. Like I helped put together a training course where we were talking through like the intricacies of like how the billing model works and like how it ties into like the actual payload that is being sent. And like if you're not optimizing against that payload, like you're being charged sometimes an order of magnitude more for the Lambda function. So like I know it's boring, but that kind of applies everywhere. Like understand the billing model. And that applies to like maybe your individual engineers don't need to know it, but like their managers probably do, at least at a high level. And then kind of in that same vein, who has seen that email that comes out from like the infrastructure operations team that goes, hey, here's a list of VMs, who's still using these, right? Like that's a really common experience. And maybe part of the answer and like one of the ways to scale out the cost of deployment is give those, maybe not the engineers, maybe the engineers, but at least those engineering managers insight as to how much are things costing, where are things still running, who spun up what, why is it still alive? Like I've seen a bunch of examples over time of like an engineer very wisely spun up a 80 node lab because they wanted to load test something. And then they forgot to spin it down. And guess what? That just cost us $20,000, right? And like having insight and like the ability for individual teams to see dashboards of like how much are things costing, like that's the other piece. Like we get really excited about like, let's go give our teams tools to go spin up their own infrastructure. That's awesome. Don't forget, like they're going to waste a bunch of money. And that's fine because it's part of experimentation and learning, but we need to give them the tools instead of, I've also seen examples of companies which then kind of snap back to, never mind, I'm not going to just let them go spin up their stuff. Like give them both, like let them spin things up, but also give them the ability to see what they're spending and how.
Vivek, was that you who spun up an 80 node lab?
I have done such things in the past, and I can totally relate to what Patrick is saying. That I have oftentimes like, so I think at CloudBees, when I was working there, and in the early days, at least, one of our colleague and one of the first DevOps person, Ben, he had this script which will automatically generate that, okay, these are the dead or not used VMs and things in Amazon, and yeah, so I know what Patrick is talking about. The resource and cost and the wastage and everything is having that insight is super, super important. And I think in general, when teams are kind of, they start off like, you can start off your project and scalability is such a thing that, understanding of it, I mean, all the way from architecture to kind of insights and how do you measure it, right? How do you know when to invest more into a scaling system? I mean, day one, you won't have it, but understanding and following from the insight, like insight into the resource utilization, but insight into kind of how the system is behaving, right? And there are a lot of solutions out there where you could tap into that. You can define even like how much to invest into improving those systems versus, keep building features by defining things like SLOs, that they are like well-practiced things, having insight into DORA metrics, those kind of things, right? That can kind of help that, so scaling is like, one is the services scaling, team is scaling, how your project basically delivers. So there's a scaling aspect of everything, and they're kind of interrelated that, and then on the inside, there is also this aspect of that, the tools that you are using, are you using the right tools that enables you to kind of, scale the system. So yeah, I mean, I think this is all kind of interrelated. I think observability, insights, all those aspects, right? Monitoring and continue measuring your systems and pay attention to when and how you want to scale. That's something super important. You have to start from somewhere, but then you kind of have a path that how you continue scaling and continue investing into scaling systems.
Patrick, any additional insight onto that?
Maybe less insight than an observation. I think it's, I'm not saying, I'm clearly not the first person who's ever said this, but I think it's interesting how much we talk about scaling up. Like we always talk about scaling up, And it seems like so much of the conversation is dominated by like, how do you do things at huge scale? I think what's equally interesting is scaling to zero. And I know lots of people talk about it. It's clearly not a brand new topic, but I love like, go build a system that can scale up. Yes, but what about when it's not being used? And that long tail of cost that it saves you by scaling to zero is huge. I know it's not interesting because it's like, well, it's like when I scale down, it still scales down to only like $50 an hour. It's like, it's still a lot over time. And like, that's ahead. Like you could have another engineer for that, right? Like it's just things like that I think are really, really interesting.
Yeah,
I'd love to see more discussion and conversation around that.
that's a great point. I think that the whole self, this auto scaling systems, they scale up and down. That's a key to it. Otherwise, cloud cost, everyone who's running into cloud, they know what it means.
Yeah, I mean that's the true value of cloud, right? Not just that you can scale up to 80 nodes like Vivek did, but yeah, that you're only using what you need when you need it. And so how do you do that? Do you look at just monitoring tools and some automation around that, or really where do you get started in terms of scaling down?
I mean, there are a couple of different paths, right? Like, and we have more options today than ever. It's like, I was making fun of it earlier for it has kind of a complex billing model, but like Lambda is a great example of that, and serverless in general is a great example of that, right? Especially for workloads that kind of fit a little bit of a funky architecture, they work really well and scale truly to zero. That's really exciting, especially for I've seen some really cool uses of serverless where they get deployed for like really strange like nonce use cases. It's like every once in a while I'm going to have this one workload that does this one thing, and what you may have previously had like a small server sitting there running that job, and once in a while it got used. Like now you have a thing that'll just spin it up once a month, and it costs you a couple bucks and you're done. And like that's pretty cool. But I mean, we've also had like that's kind of the beauty and the excitement of containers, and the more that you can get to a place where you have stateless containers, the more you can really play with scaling very, very far down and very, very far up. I think that's one of the really difficult parts from an architectural concern. It's really tough for people to build truly stateless applications. We're getting better at it as an industry. But if you can really get to statelessness in your applications, like now it's kind of sky's the limit on how flexible your infrastructure can be. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, I think the whole scaling down aspect, like auto scaling aspect, it doesn't come for free. You can go for like serverless kind of thing, but the reality is that that's the part of engineering and architecture, is that there would still be system, right, which you will be building and you will be scaling out. And then you have to have a way to kind of, put the same kind of engineering that how do you scale back, right? So it's engineering really. And then some of the things that could come for free in a way that like, serverless or Lambda and those things, right? Where you could, you have more workload, okay, push it out there and then scale accordingly. And I think in general, I think SaaS kind of helps. So for example, databases and things like that, there could be, depending upon the service provider, there could be things like persistent, storages, like, Postgres as a service or MySQL as a service or any such thing, right? That could come along, which could help you kind of scale that way. And however they kind of scale up and down is not your problem, but then there would be some system you definitely be building, right? Maybe event queue processor or things like that, where you are going to consume more and more resources, and you have to be kind of mindful of that how do you build such systems.